Samira Khan sat on the windowsill of her small house in the suburbs of Atlanta, gazing at the sunset, which was casting shades of orange and pink on the horizon. Her life had always seemed clearly delineated, with the roles of wife, daughter, and Muslim merging into a flawlessly organized chain of responsibilities. But inside her, she longed for something more. She did not always understand what exactly she was missing. However, with each passing day, the feeling of her own imprisonment in her marriage to Ismail grew stronger. Her husband, Ismail Ahmad, returned from work a little earlier than usual. His heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway as he entered the living room. Tall and stout, Ismail always gave the impression of a stern and unyielding man. He was conservative, convinced that a wife's mission was to keep the house comfortable and obedient to her husband. Samira knew he loved her in his own way, but it was a suffocating love. "What are you doing?" Ismail's voice sounded dry and commanding when he spotted her at the window. "Just looking at the sunset," Samira replied, trying to keep the bitterness out of her voice. "Better make some tea." Samira nodded and walked into the kitchen, her movements automatic, honed by years of daily routine. As she poured water into the kettle, she thought for a moment. At that moment, she felt the silk of her favorite blue ribbon on her wrist, the only symbol of her freedom. The ribbon was a gift from her mother, who had once said, "Never forget that there is a part of you inside that no one can take away." That evening, the Ahmad family gathered for a big family dinner. Ismail, Samira, and several of his close relatives met at the elder's house. Among the guests was Ismail's cousin, Amir Ahmad, and his presence did not leave Samira indifferent. Amir was the opposite of Ismail. Although he also adhered to traditions, his eyes shone with an unbridled passion for life. Dark-skinned and charismatic, he was always the center of attention. When he met Samira's eyes, he smiled slightly, and it made her heart beat faster. During dinner, Amir repeatedly tried to catch Samira's eye. She noticed it, but tried not to show her emotions. After dinner, the guests went to different parts of the house, talking and discussing family news. Amir approached Samira when they were alone in the garden. "You don't look happy," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "You should be," Samira replied, trying to convince herself more than him. Amir sighed and looked down. He knew that there was an invisible gulf between them, separated by family and religious norms. "If you ever need to escape," he gently touched her hand, "you know where to find me." The touch was almost weightless, but Samira felt an electric shock through her body. She knew it was dangerous, but for the first time in years, she felt something real. The following weeks were a test for Samira. Ismail increasingly paid attention to her behavior, becoming suspicious and even more controlling. He noticed changes in her mood but could not understand exactly why. Amir, on the other hand, began to write her messages, trying to keep in touch. Their meetings were short and cautious, but each moment nourished Samira. Amir became for her what she had been looking for so long, a way out of her everyday captivity. One day they met in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Amir gently put his hand on her wrist, touching the ribbon. "Do you still wear it?" "It reminds me that I haven't completely lost myself," she replied quietly. "You will never lose yourself unless you let it happen," Amir said, his voice sounding like a promise. Their meeting did not last long. They knew they were taking a risk, but they couldn't stop. Every minute together was a stolen joy, and it made their connection even more exciting and dangerous. That night, Samira returned home later than usual. Ismail was waiting for her in the living room, his face tense. "Where have you been?" he asked, clenching his fists. "At a friend's. We had tea and talked about life," she answered, trying to remain calm. Ismail didn't believe her but kept quiet. His suspicions were growing, and he was sure that something was going on behind his back. He could not let it happen. Samira went up to the bedroom, her heart beating like crazy. She knew that sooner or later Ismail would find out the truth, but her fear was not strong enough to make her stop these meetings. Amir was what allowed her to breathe, and even if things went wrong, she felt that the risk was worth every moment she spent with him. The following weeks turned Samira's life into a maze of secret meetings and constant anxiety. She lived a double life, By day, she was an obedient wife who fulfilled Ismail's duties and expectations, and by night, she transformed into a woman who longed for love, passion, and freedom, all the things Amir gave her. Their meetings took place in the strangest places. In an old motel on the outskirts of the city, in a cramped cafe hidden in the shade of trees, or even in a cozy park late at night when the city was already asleep. Amir was always cautious, but at the same time daring. His looks and touches gave Samira hope that she was still alive, that her dreams had a right to exist. "You deserve something better than living under Ismail's dictates," he told her once when they met in the park. "It's not that simple, Amir," she replied with a sigh. "If he finds out that there is something between us, it will be over for both of us." Amir smiled slightly. "Or we could finally be free." Samira looked at him with a mixture of excitement and fear. Her life had never been easy, but what she was experiencing with Amir was even more frightening. It was like walking on the edge of a cliff. Every step could be the last. At the same time, Ismail was becoming increasingly tense. He felt that something was changing, that his wife was moving away from him. His jealousy grew into anger, and his suspicions became an obsession. He checked her phone several times, but found nothing suspicious. However, he was sure that Samira was hiding something. He was haunted by the feeling that another man had appeared in her life. One evening, Ismail hinted at it while they were sitting at dinner. "You've changed, Samira." "What's going on?" Samira tried to remain calm. "Nothing. I'm just a little tired." "Tired?" He looked her in the eyes carefully. "Of what?" "Of everyday life, Ismail. We all get tired sometimes." His gaze never left hers, as if he were trying to read her thoughts. "If you are hiding something, I will find out," he said quietly, and the words sounded like a threat. Samira knew that it was only a matter of time before Ismail would start looking for evidence of his suspicions. She dreaded the moment when everything would come to light, but at the same time, part of her wanted it to happen. Perhaps then she would finally be able to escape from this life. Amir, on the other hand, realized that the situation was getting more complicated. One day he called Samira and asked her to meet him at the same motel where they had been several times before. They knew that each meeting could be the last, but they couldn't stop. "We can't go on like this," Samira said as they sat together on the bed in the room. "He will find out soon." Amir gently took her hand in his. "Then let's run away together." "Are you serious?" She looked at him in surprise. "We can live anywhere. I'll find a job and you can be happy." Samira sighed. The idea sounded appealing, but she knew it wouldn't be that easy. Her family wouldn't forgive her for doing this, and Ismail wouldn't leave them alone. "It's too dangerous, Amir. He'll find us." "He can't stop us if we're together," he assured her. Samira hesitated. Her heart was eager for a new life, but her mind told her that the consequences could be dire. When she returned home that evening, Samira found Ismail in an unusually good mood. He greeted her with a smile and even invited her to have tea with him. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said," he said as they sat in the kitchen. "Maybe you and I really need to make a change." Samira looked up. "What kind of change do you mean?" "Maybe we could go away for the weekend? We could change the scenery, get away." Her heart sped up. This proposal seemed unreal to her. Ismail, who had always been in control, suddenly suggested letting go of their routine. It didn't fit with her idea of him. "That would be great," she replied, although everything inside her screamed danger. That night, Samira couldn't sleep for a long time. Something in Ismail's behavior was disturbing her. She felt that it was the calm before the storm. The next day, Amir called her and said they needed to talk. They agreed to meet in the evening at a motel. Samira hesitated but finally agreed. She knew she couldn't go on living in fear. They met as they always did, and Amir offered her the chance to decide what to do next. "I don't want to lose you, Samira. If you are ready, we will go together. If not, this will be our last night together." Samira was silent. Her heart was beating fast, and she realized that this decision would change her whole life. The night was quiet and dark, like a secret that Samira and Amir were carefully hiding. They sat together in an old motel room, far from prying eyes. Their meeting place had always been carefully chosen, but they both knew it was only a matter of time before this illusion of security would be shattered. "How much longer can we live like this?" Samira asked, wrapping herself in a blanket. Her voice was muffled, tired mixed with fear and hope. Amir watched her, sitting across from her on the edge of the bed. He sighed and rubbed his face lightly. "I don't know, but the longer we wait, the worse it gets. You do realize that, right?" Samira nodded, lowering her head. Her favorite blue ribbon adorned her wrists, and she automatically ran her fingers through it. It seemed to her that this ribbon was the only thing keeping her afloat in this chaos. "I can't leave now," she whispered. Amir leaned closer, trying to look into her eyes. "And if you stay, you'll destroy yourself." Her heart was clenching with despair. Every word, every encounter with Amir was like a blade cutting deeper into her life. But she knew she couldn't stop. He was the only person who understood her and gave her the sense of freedom she craved. "I have to go," she finally said, getting out of bed. "Otherwise, things will get even worse." Amir nodded silently. He knew that this was another retreat, but he hoped it would not be the last. "Take care," he said as they stood at the door. "If anything goes wrong, call me right away." Samira nodded and squeezed his hand lightly before stepping out into the darkness of the night. The walk home was short, but it seemed like an eternity. Samira could feel the tension building inside her with every step. She was afraid to go home, but she knew she had no other choice. Her life was locked inside the walls of the house with Ismail, which was becoming more and more like her prison. She walked quickly, head down, hiding in the shadows of the streets. She thought someone was watching her, but when she turned around, she saw only emptiness. When she finally reached the house, her heart was pounding as if it would jump out of her chest. She took out her keys and quietly unlocked the door, careful not to wake Ismail if he was home. Inside, the silence was too deep and unnatural, like a premonition of trouble. Samira took off her shoes and quietly walked down the hall to her bedroom. Her body was tired and tense, and she dreamed of only a few hours of sleep before her world began to crumble again. But suddenly she felt something strange, as if there was someone else in the house. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the ribbon around her wrist, as if it could protect her. She heard a soft rustling behind her, and her heart sank. Samira turned around, but it was too late. A dark figure emerged from the shadows, and before she could scream, a cold blade stabbed her in the chest. Pain pierced her body, and she fell to the floor, gasping for breath in shock and pain. Everything around her was blurring, and the last thing she saw was her blue ribbon falling out of her hand and gently falling to the carpet. Silence again enveloped the house, leaving only Samira's body lying motionless on the floor. Blood slowly spread under her, forming a dark stain on the carpet. Detectives Jessica Rose and Alistair Blake were already on their feet when the call came in at 5 a.m. They had been called to the police station about the brutal murder of a young woman on the outskirts of town. "Another tough one," Jessica muttered as she got behind the wheel. She already had a feeling this was going to be more than just a domestic dispute. "Let's see what we can find," added her partner Alistair. He had always believed in the power of Jessica's intuition, but he wasn't used to drawing conclusions before he saw things with his own eyes. They arrived at the house in 20 minutes. Police cars had already surrounded the crime scene, and Lieutenant Maxwell, who was in charge of the scene, met them at the door. "The victim is Samira Khan, 28, he began as they entered. Neighbors didn't hear anything. Her husband said he was away. Jessica and Alistair exchanged glances. They knew there was always someone who had heard something, but was afraid to speak up. "Where is the husband?" Alistair asked, wiping the raindrops from his jacket. "We decided to invite him to talk to you until you arrive," the lieutenant replied. "Let's take a look at the crime scene," Jessica said. The bedroom was in disarray, though it didn't look like a struggle. There was an untied blue ribbon on the floor next to the body and a lamp knocked over. Samira herself was lying face down on the carpet, with a stab wound in her chest. Her arm was outstretched as if she was trying to reach for something before she died. "Looks like a close-range attack," Alistair said as he crouched down next to the body. Jessica looked at the ribbon lying next to her. "Did she always wear this ribbon on her wrist?" she asked the lieutenant. "Yes, the family confirmed it," he replied. Why is it on the floor now? Jessica wondered aloud, more to herself than anyone else. She knew that such details were often important. On the table in the corner was a glass cup with fingerprints on it. Has this cup always been here? My husband says it hasn't. Maybe it belongs to the killer, the lieutenant replied. Let's get the prints, she ordered. Alistair leaned closer to the body. There are no signs of forced entry. Maybe the victim knew the killer and opened the door for him. Yeah, or he had a key, Jessica added. Her intuition told her this wasn't going to be an easy case. The detectives arrived at the police station where Ismail Ahmad was already sitting in the interrogation room. He was calm, but tense. At first glance, this was the usual experience of a man who learned of his wife's death. But Jessica knew that such calmness often hides something more. Mr. Ahmad, Jessica began, sitting down across from him, you said you were away that night. Where exactly were you? I spent the night with friends, he replied, not looking her in the eye. Can you give us the names? We'll check, Alistair added. Ismail nodded, but his movement was too mechanical. Did you know that your wife was having an affair? Jessica asked him bluntly. Rumors. I heard rumors, but I didn't believe them. Have you spoken to your cousin Amir lately? Alistair asked, watching for a reaction. Ismail clenched his hands into fists under the table, but his voice remained steady. Where was he that night? Jessica glared at him. I don't know. We don't talk as much as we used to, Ismail replied. His answers were too cautious, and Jessica knew that cautiousness often hides a lie. After the questioning, the detectives left the room and stopped in the hallway, exchanging glances. He's hiding something, that's obvious, Alistair said, but we don't have enough evidence to arrest him yet. Ismail knew about Samira's relationship with Amir, even if he doesn't want to admit it, Jessica added. That gives him a motive. What about Amir? Could he be involved? He could, but there's something that's been bugging me, Jessica said, looking thoughtfully at the ribbon they'd taken as evidence. This ribbon. It was found untied next to the body. Samira never took it off for no reason. You think she was trying to say something? Alistair suggested. Maybe. Or maybe it was a sign left by the killer. But why? Jessica wondered. These first hours of the investigation had only confused the case. Although suspicions about Ismail were growing, detectives had no direct evidence of his involvement. Amir also remained a suspect because he was closely associated with Samira. However, small details, a blue ribbon, a cup with prints, hinted that the solution was hidden somewhere in these small fragments. With every passing minute, the detectives were getting closer to realizing that this case was more than just jealousy or an accidental murder. Behind this tragedy was a story that would change the lives of all those involved. The investigation into Samira Khan's murder became more complicated with each new piece of evidence that emerged. Jessica Rose and Alistair Blake were slowly putting the puzzle together, but many fragments were still scattered in a chaotic picture of lies, jealousy, and secrets. Something about this case was bothering them. Small details seemed to whisper the truth, but they hadn't yet formed a coherent picture. The next day, the detectives decided to meet with Amir Ahmad. He was an important figure in Samira's life, and although they had no reason to accuse him yet, his involvement in the story aroused suspicion. Amir agreed to meet with the police without protest, which at first glance looked like a sign of his innocence. Amir looked tired, as if his life had been turned upside down in the past few days. Did you know about Samira and Ismail's relationship? Alistair asked, starting the interrogation. Amir smiled sadly. Relationship? It could not be called a relationship. It was a trap she was trying to escape from. Jessica looked at him closely. You were her way out? Amir thought for a moment before answering. Yes, I wanted her to be happy, and we both knew that this was only possible without Ismail. Why didn't you leave together? Were you planning to escape? Alistair asked. Amir sighed, his shoulders slumped. We did. But she couldn't leave. She was afraid of the consequences. She was afraid of him. Jessica leaned forward a little. Did you know she was going to die that night? No, of course not. Amir suddenly became nervous. I loved her. I would never have let something like that happen to her. His reaction seemed sincere, but Jessica knew that sincerity didn't always mean the truth. "Where were you that night?" she asked. "I was at home, by myself. No witnesses, if that's what you mean," Amir replied with an ironic smile. The detectives exchanged glances. Without an alibi, Amir remained among the suspects, but they could not yet link him to the crime. While Jessica and Alistair were conducting interrogations, the results of the fingerprint analysis on the glass cup found at the crime scene came back from the lab. "The man was at the crime scene," Alistair stated as he looked over the results, "but he said he wasn't home that night." "Now we know he was lying," Jessica said as she picked up the tape from the evidence bag. "But why leave a cup with his own prints on it? It's too obvious." Alistair shrugged. "Maybe he didn't think about it. Or maybe he wanted it to look like an accident. Or someone is trying to set him up," Jessica added. "We don't know everything yet." With the new evidence, the detectives invited Ismail for another interview. "Your fingerprints were found on a cup that was in the house at the time of the murder," Jessica said, watching his reaction closely. "That doesn't mean I was there that night. This is my house. My fingerprints could be anywhere." "You said you were at a friend's house, but it doesn't matter now because your fingerprints say otherwise," Alistair added. Ismail clenched his hands tightly on the table, but he still held his composure. "That doesn't prove I killed her." "But it does prove you lied," Jessica insisted. Ismail hesitated, but didn't answer. It was as if he was waiting for them to say something more to see how much they already knew. After the interrogation, Jessica and Alistair returned to the police station, feeling that Ismail was hiding something. But they couldn't arrest him without hard evidence. They knew that there was only one detail missing from the case that would put everything in its place. Jessica was carefully looking through the evidence when her eyes landed on a blue ribbon. She held it in her hands, wondering why it could be so important to Samira. "What if the ribbon wasn't just an accessory?" she said quietly. Alistair looked up. "What do you mean?" "She always wore it on her wrist. But at the time of the murder, the ribbon was untied and lying on the floor," Jessica explained. "Do you think she took it off on purpose?" "Yes, maybe to leave us a clue," Jessica said, her eyes shining with sudden insight. And this ribbon was a symbol of her freedom. She left it on the floor as a sign that whoever killed her had taken that freedom away. Alistair thought about her words. "It means that she knew the killer, and that he was someone who was always in control of her," Jessica added. "This could be an important clue to our investigation." They knew they were close to the truth, but every little detail had to fall into place to solve Samira's murder. The blue ribbon lying next to her body, Ismail's prints on the cup, and his false alibi created a clear but incomplete puzzle. They knew they had to find a key piece of evidence to prove their case. Jessica sat at her desk, going through the case files again. Her fingers touched the records of Samira's phone calls over the past few days. One of them stood out. The last call, a few minutes before she died, was made by Amir. "She talked to Amir before she died," Jessica said, showing Alistair the report. "But what if it wasn't just a conversation?" Alistair frowned. "Do you think she was trying to warn him?" "Yes, or ask for help. But he didn't come, and now I wonder why." They decided to talk to Amir again, trying to find out why he hadn't helped Samira that night. Amir sat in the interrogation room looking exhausted. He was no longer trying to keep up a confident appearance. The detectives could see that he felt guilty. "You called Samira that night," Jessica began. "What did you discuss?" Amir sighed heavily and ran his hand over his face. "I asked her to come with me. She said she was afraid he would find her." "You knew she was in danger," Jessica insisted. Amir lowered his head. "She asked me not to come. She said she could handle it herself." "You knew she couldn't," Alistair added quietly. Amir was silent. His silence was eloquent. He loved Samira, but at a critical moment he abandoned her, leaving her alone with danger. Detectives were increasingly convinced that Ismail was involved in the crime. However, they lacked direct evidence. They decided to conduct a thorough inspection of the house to find any new clues that would link him to the crime scene. During the search, they found Samira's notebook hidden in a closet behind her clothes. On the last pages, she made several entries that became crucial to the case. "He knows about Amir and me. He said that if I left him, he would destroy us," Jessica read. Her heart clenched in horror. "That's all we need," Alistair said. He threatened her. He had a motive. But they still had to find a way to prove that Ismail was actually in the house at the time of the murder. The lab sent back additional analysis results. The tape found near Samira's body had fingerprints on it, and they belonged to Ismail. This was definitive proof that he was there when the tape was removed. "He removed her tape as a symbol of having taken away her freedom," Jessica said, her voice full of determination. "This wasn't just a murder. It was revenge. He wanted her to know that she couldn't run away from him." "We have everything we need to arrest him," Alistair concluded. When the detectives came to Ismail's house with an arrest warrant, he initially tried to remain confident, but quickly broke down under the pressure of the evidence. "You still can't understand," he said during the interrogation. "She betrayed me. She betrayed everything I believed in." "You couldn't accept that she wanted a different life," Jessica added. Ismail lowered his head, admitting his guilt without words. "She was mine," he whispered, "and no one else's." Ismail Ahmad was arrested for the murder of his wife Samira. All the small details, the blue ribbon, the prints on the cup, the notebook, added up to a gruesome picture of a crime motivated by jealousy and a desire for control. The case of Samira Khan's murder received wide media coverage. The shocking combination of betrayal, jealousy, and murder aroused public interest. The trial of Ismail Ahmad became a topic of discussion not only in Atlanta, but also in the city's Muslim community, which was divided in its views on this tragic case. The trial lasted several months. The prosecution had strong evidence, Ismail's fingerprints on the ribbon and the cup, as well as entries in Samira's personal diary that indicated his threats. Prosecutors based their strategy on the fact that Ismail killed his wife in a fit of jealousy after he learned about her relationship with his cousin, Amir. Ismail's lawyer tried to prove that the murder was committed in a state of passion, in a moment of uncontrollable emotion. He insisted that Ismail lost his mind when he learned about the betrayal, and therefore his actions were not pre-planned. But the prosecutors rejected this argument. They proved that Ismail acted deliberately, as he took a knife with him, which indicated the intention to kill. Amir Ahmad took the stand at the trial. He confirmed that Samira had serious intentions to leave Ismail, but she did not dare to do so because of her fear of him. Amir admitted that he also felt guilty because he could not protect the woman he loved. His testimony became an important part of the trial, but it caused mixed emotions among those present in the courtroom. After several weeks of hearings, the jury found Ismail Ahmad guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read out in the courtroom, Ismail sat motionless, showing no emotion. He accepted his sentence with the same cold calmness that had frightened the detectives from the beginning. Only for a moment, when he was being led away under escort, he whispered quietly, "She was supposed to belong only to me." The city's Muslim community was deeply divided. Some people condemned Ismail for his cruelty, arguing that religion does not justify violence. They supported the court's decision and sympathized with Samira's family. The other part believed that Samira herself provoked the tragedy by her betrayal. This caused internal conflicts in the community, which were discussed for a long time after the case was over. Amir Ahmad left Atlanta shortly after the trial was over. He could not live in a city where so much pain had happened. His love for Samira remained an unfinished story that haunted him for the rest of his life. Samira's family was crushed by her death. Her mother was unable to hold back her tears in court when she said that her daughter dreamed of simple happiness but could not find it. Her father bitterly told reporters, "We lost our daughter to a man who did not understand that love cannot be won by force." After the case was over, Jessica Rose and Alistair Blake were silent for a long time, discussing it during their last conversation in a cafe. "There are no winners in stories like this," Jessica said, staring into her coffee cup. "Even when you find the killer, the pain doesn't go away." "No," Alistair agreed. "But at least we gave her justice, and that's all we could do." The little details, Jessica said thoughtfully. They always reveal more than meets the eye. The blue ribbon was a clue, but it was really a story about lost choice and freedom. They finished their coffee and went their separate ways, putting the case behind them, but not quite. Each of them realized that tragedies like this do not end in the courtroom. They continue to live on in the memories of those who are left behind. Amir never returned to Atlanta. He left the city filled with guilt and despair. The very life he had tried to build with Samira had turned into a disaster. Every thought of her haunted him, leaving an emptiness in his heart. In the new city, Amir tried to start his life over, but real peace never came. He could not get rid of the thought that if he had been braver, he could have saved her. Every time he saw a blue ribbon, in a store window or on someone's wrist, the pain returned like an open wound. For Samira's mother, her daughter's death was the hardest blow of her life. She could not recover from the tragedy for a long time. Every week, she visited Samira's grave, putting flowers there and leaving small things that reminded her of her childhood. She loved this ribbon so much, the mother said in an interview, showing journalists a blue accessory that had been left at home among Samira's personal belongings. I hoped it would bring her happiness, but it didn't. Life went on, as it always does after tragedies. People who knew Samira continued on their way, but with her name in their hearts. The story of this woman who sought love and freedom, but encountered an obstacle in the form of jealousy and control, left a mark in the memory of those who lived through it. Freedom sometimes comes too late, but her memory remains alive. And although Samira's life ended tragically, her story has become a warning to many others. Because even the smallest details, like the ribbon on her wrist, can carry enormous meaning.